Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for attending our panel symposium on a decade of urbanization and global environmental change research. My name is Corey Griffith. I'm the director of the Eugec project. And I thought for those of you who might be new to the project, I would just give a very, very brief introduction about the project. The Eugec project has been hosted at ASU within the Global Institute of Sustainability since 2006. Our particular project is one of several core projects that fall underneath this umbrella of the global environmental change programs, which have actually now transitioned into a new initiative called Future Earth, which I think will come up in our discussions later. Our particular project is unique in that the office is one of just a few that are actually based within the United States. Many of our other sister core projects are based within Europe and a few in other regions. Our project in particular really looks towards advancing the science and understanding of the interactions between urbanization and global environmental change, which takes place at multiple scales. And ultimately, our project is a science coordination or networking project. So over the last decade, we've been really interested in trying to build and enhance the regional networks of scientists and practitioners that are studying and working at this interface to build also an international community. And so it's a very interesting time for the Eugec project. We've been in existence now for a decade. I should also mention that our project is, of course, based here, and that's where our staff is located, but we also are governed by a scientific steering committee, which is a 10-member group, and it's a diverse group of scientists, 4 of whom are here as our panelists today, to whom you'll be introduced in just a few moments. We have a number of our other steering committee members here in our audience today. And in part, we wanted to do this panel because we wanted to share our knowledge of what we've learned over the last decade and have a discussion with you about what are the needs for moving forward. This particular panel is actually an event that's amongst several others that have taken place this week. Our scientific steering committee has been here to discuss the future directions of Eugec, what might exist beyond the decade that we've had so far. And we've had a series of events and workshops where we've discussed other projects and activities that really include other urban communities, not just the Eugec community, but thinking about how we can broaden our community and develop new initiatives as well. And I think I'll leave it there because I think some of this is going to be discussed by our panelists before you. So what I'd like to do now is I should make mention that this is part of the Sustainability Solutions Festival that's taking place this week. I should acknowledge the sponsors of that, which is the City of Phoenix, the Salt River Project, and the Walton Family Foundation. And this is all organized by the ASU Walton Sustainability Solutions Initiative. For those of you who are social media savvy, we encourage you to send your thoughts to #Sustival, which is SUSTIVAL. And you can also follow us on Twitter at UGEC Project, which is just UGEC Project. And if you need any more information about the Sustainability Solutions Festival, you can go to sustainabilityfestival.asu.edu. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and present our moderator for the day, which is Dr. Chris Boone. He is professor and dean of the School of Sustainability, and also Eugec Scientific Steering Committee member. Thanks, Chris.
So I think I was asked to be a moderator because I'm just a moderate person, but we'll find out over the course of the next couple of hours. So first, let me thank all of you for coming to this presentation today. I know there's a lot of activities going on at any given time on this campus. I actually worried about losing some of you to the job fair on the way in, so I'm glad that you continued on, decided not to apply for a job at Amazon. So I'm happy to see you here. Before we get started, let me just introduce some of the members of the Scientific Steering Committee and also our panelists. And then I'll just say a few words about Eugec just to set the context of the discussion that's going to take place. Let me just close my email here for a second. All right, so 2 members that are not here with us today are Peter Marcotulio, who's an associate professor of geography at Hunter College, Second is our co-chair, who's been with us from the very beginning, and that's Roberto Rodriguez Sanchez, who's from El Colegio de la Frontera Norte in Mexico, and also a professor emeritus at UC Riverside. Darren McAvoy. Darren, you want to raise your hand? You can certainly pose questions to these members as well, who's with our MIT University in Melbourne. We have Shuli Huang. Shuli Huang is with the Graduate Institute of Urban Planning at National Taipei University. We have Shanjiang Deng, who's with the Institute of Geographical Sciences and Natural Resources Research at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And then there's me as well. I'm also a member of the steering committee. Our panelists, first to my left here is Karen Seto, who is at Yale University. She's the Associate Dean for Research in addition to being a Professor of Geography and Urbanization. Karen. Next is Shuaib Lwasa, who is an Associate Professor of Geography at Makerere University. And then we have David Simon, who has a couple of roles now. He's the former head of the Geography Department at Royal Holloway, which is a part of the University of London system, which is now one of our partners through the Plus Alliance and is now leading Mistra Urban Futures out of Sweden. And then last we have Patty Romero-Lankao, who is with NCAR in Boulder and also hails from Mexico City. Is that correct? Yeah. All right. So what I'll start with is just to set the context of the discussion, because all of you may not be familiar with Eugec, is to go very briefly through the science plan, the essence of the science plan, which really kicked this off 10 years ago. And the title in itself, I think, is important because when we're talking about urbanization and global environmental change, this is a really important shift in the way that most people were thinking about cities historically, which is looking at the implications of urbanization, usually the bad implications of urbanization on local environmental conditions, whether that be air quality or water pollution or the consumption of farmlands in and around cities. And what this project really tried to do was to understand urbanization as one of the key drivers of change in not only, of course, in this century, but also in the past century. We know, obviously, that cities are it's now habitat for the majority of humanity. And in the Anthropocene, urbanization is one of the fundamental drivers of the changes that we're seeing on global levels that feed back and affect not just ecosystems, but also human well-being. So the urbanization and global environmental change is a really important thing to remember, and I think that's been a huge contribution in this project. But we'll talk to the panelists in a moment to get their take on that issue. All right. So the Eugec conceptual framework, when I first saw this, I was very pleased to see it because in many ways it mirrored an experience that I'd already had with the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, which really tried to emphasize the notion of feedback relationships between social dynamics and ecological dynamics. But you'll see on this slide, on the two sides, there's an understanding of looking at the urban system as both a built environment, but more broadly a landscape, and on the right-hand side, looking at biophysical and chemical systems of the planet, and looking at the interactions between the two. So the science plan is framed out under 4 themes. The first is urban processes that contribute to global environmental change. And there's a series of sub-questions. I won't go into them in great detail. You can read them on the screen. But the notion here is, again, really to look at how urban systems are not just affecting local environments, but how are they driving global environmental change more generally. The second theme, pathways through which global environmental change affects the urban system. So here's a kind of feedback relationship. So when we're looking at whether it's climate change or biodiversity loss or changes in biogeochemical cycling, what does that do in terms of how we live our lives, how cities grow, the constraints as well as the opportunities of urbanization? The third theme is to look more closely at interactions of biophysical and the social within urban systems. And this is something that a number of projects here on campus, in addition to others around the world, have been looking at, but it's set in this context of these 4 larger themes. And then finally, what are the consequences of the interactions within urban systems on global environmental change? So the interactions between ecological and social systems, how does this in the era of the Anthropocene start to affect some of the key drivers of concern? So that in a nutshell is the origins of this project and has really guided a lot of the research that's happened over the last decade. So what we're going to do now, because I don't want to talk, I want you to have an opportunity to hear from the panelists. I'm going to turn to the panelists and open up the discussion. And I want to start with the science plan, because again, this was something that really is foundational to everything that followed. And we happen to have two people who were there at the very beginning, Karen and David. So I'm going to ask Karen to kick off and give us, Karen, your assessment of how the science plan came to be and how it influenced not only the nature of this project, but more generally our understanding of urbanization and global environmental change. Karen.
Thanks, Chris. Well, I think it might be useful to take a little step down memory lane to remember what it was like in terms of the global change programs in 2002, which is when one of the core global change programs, which is IHDP, basically launched a new project, which was Eugec at that time. And in 2002, the study of urban was very much about local, as Chris said, and there was certainly a number of research programs and projects and individual PIs who were working on urban as it relates to global processes, but there wasn't a community, certainly not in the way that we see today in 2016. So I think it's really important to remember where we were in 2002. And when the genesis of the project was that there were already a number of existing IHDP projects and IGBP projects. Some of you may be familiar with the old IGBP projects. And so when IHDP decided to look for a new project around the concept of urban, the idea was, let's get some feedback from existing or contributions from existing programs from IGBP and IHDP. And that explains why the land component is such a large part of the original science plan, is that there was a land project that was a joint IHDP, IGBP project, and there was a very large community looking at urban land change. That was one reason for land having such a strong component in the UGEC science plan. In terms of Chris's direct question of how far have we come and what contributions have we made, I think it's very clear that a lot of the science over the last 10 years has been on the first theme, really looking at how urbanization aggregated across local scales affects global change. There's a lot of research now, whether it's looking at emissions or land use change or effects on biogeochemical cycles. I would say in terms of the third and fourth themes, there's a lot less research in terms of understanding how human systems, governance systems are reacting. I think the other thing that we've seen also is a lot of research, especially in the last 5 years, looking at how urban systems are being affected by global environmental change. So a lot of work on adaptation and vulnerability of urban systems. So it's very clear that there's a lot of contribution in the science and in our community in these first two themes.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case, but also crucially, the way in which these issues were both manifesting themselves empirically, if you like, but perhaps more importantly, were being perceived and understood and acted upon or ignored in different parts of the world, was very diverse. And one of the challenges that we had as a small group of 6 of us, 7 of us, coming together to draft the science plan back in about 2003, 2004, was to try to address that sort of heterogeneity as well and create a framework, which Chris has just run us through, that, as it were, would work on a global level. I don't just mean global processes, but I mean in terms of the reception, if you like, and engagement with it in different parts of the world. And I think we've actually been remarkably successful in that, and we'll no doubt come to talk about that in more detail. But I think that is important to register. And that is still probably true today, although one of the things that I think we have contributed to as one of the successes of the project is actually getting regional communities engaged and crucially promoting the idea. Closer, okay.
Better.
People can't hear me? That's unusual.
Yeah.
Okay.
It happens.
Okay. To get engagement and to understand the globality of the changes and the processes. It's the sort of transboundary effect that, rather like pollution we've known about for decades, but environmental change, climate change, the different direct and indirect parameters of that don't respect political or administrative boundaries. And that has really only in the last few years started to infiltrate, if you like, political agendas, as we've seen most recently at the COP21 in Paris. But also if you think about, say, how the IPCC assessment reports have changed. When we started out, urban issues were just beginning to receive a little bit of attention, whereas the first three, I think, almost never mentioned urban, and 4 was the first one that had a central focus, and 5, again, the scale and the scope of attention reflects the way in which these concerns have been taken up and appreciated by the broader scientific and, crucially, the political and the international governance agencies in a way that actually we couldn't even have imagined at the time that we set out to draft the report.
Thank you. So each one of these panelists represents also regional expertise. So even though the focus has been on global environmental change, we recognize that those contexts can be very important in the kinds of questions that we ask and the methods that we use and so forth. So Erin has done a lot of work in East Asia and South Asia. Shuaib Lwasa has done a lot of work in Africa and Southeast Asia. David has done a lot of work in Africa as well as Europe, now more recently with his work with Mistra. And Patty has done a lot of work in North America as well as Latin America. So what I'd like to ask Shuaib to begin with is to say a few words about how UGEC has made a difference to the kinds of work that you've done in a regional context in Africa and in Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Chris. Maybe I would start with a little bit of historical involvement in UGEC. I'm one of the, I think, about 20 early career researchers who participated in the IHDP 2002 scoping workshop, where we came from different parts of the world. I think about 4 or 5 of us from, 3 from Africa, 1 from Egypt, Abu, and Karen and David Simon and other people like Bio Saliki were there. And we discussed a lot of things, but there are 2 things that I want to mention on that. One was the kind of taking stock of what is happening regionally, even when it wasn't very representative in terms of urban research. That partly fed into the science plan. But the other element was also the capacity development. We were really young and we were coming up, and the process and the tools that we were exposed to enabled us to continue engaging with urban research and under UGEC, and I'm privileged to be on the science committee. So that is a testimony to the growth of the UGEC community. But coming to your question of how this UGEC has influenced the engagement in Africa, there are a number of things, activities that have happened. We have had regional capacity development workshops in Africa, one in Dhaka, organized by UGEC, but there are a couple of others that were organized by us individually after, starting UGEC projects where lots of early career researchers and colleagues at different levels have taken up the urbanization issues in Africa and being able to generate the knowledge to understand the processes of urban growth and development in Africa that differs greatly from other regions around the world. Can describe it in a way that you have runaway cities, you have cities with deficits in infrastructure and services, you have cities that are largely informal, and now we are calling the informal being the city. So that has really come off the UGEC science plan and the UGEC community of practice.
Excellent, thank you. Patty, could you make some comments on, from your perspective, and the work that you've done in North America? I know you've done some work elsewhere, but especially North America and Latin America.
Yeah, thank you. I was one of the ones that read the science plan, and I really was inspired by it. And what the community that I represent and the colleagues I work with have focused on are 2 key components of the UGEC agenda. The first, we have tried to understand how human and biophysical and built environment factors and processes come together to explain why some urban populations are more vulnerable or else resilient to heat waves, floods and other hazards that climate change is expected to aggravate and is already aggravating. So we really have done work at the global level, mostly statistical work, trying to use some indicators of urbanization, such as levels and rates of urban growth and economic growth, how they correlate with indicators of sensitivity, such as age, and capacity, such as access to infrastructures and services, meaning to water and also to other sewage systems, etc. So we have tried to understand how these come together and to explain why some populations are more or less able to respond to this. And we have worked at the global, national, and city level. So that's one thing. And I really think that one of my sources of inspiration before I joined the group was our science plan. But we also have been very engaged, particularly in Latin America and more recently in the US, in an effort to understand how populations and stakeholders and actors come together to innovate, to respond, to create spontaneous and also planned responses to the challenges posed by climate change, the mitigation and adaptation challenges. And I think that we have a very rich body of literature on what we call urban governance and how national level actors and decisions and rules and regulations can constrain or else offer options for urban actors to respond to sustainability and resilience challenges. So Latin America can really contribute a lot to this and has contributed a lot to this literature, and also the US for sure.
Okay, thanks very much. So the Eugec project started off as a core project of the International Human Dimensions Program, and that's important to know because it means that a lot of the questions that came out of the group were leading with social sciences rather than ending with social science questions. However, as Karen and others have suggested, is that the focus on the urban has extended well beyond the social sciences realm, which is, I think, typically where a lot of it started. If you look historically in sociology and other disciplines, there's been thinking about the city for at least a century. So Nancy Grimm just walked in late. Dan Childers is here, and others who've been really instrumental in building up the field of urban ecology. And given the nature of the questions that we're asking, clearly one of the fertile opportunities is thinking about how engineers, how ecologists, and social scientists, but others, even ethicists, philosophers, and so forth, are thinking about cities and urbanization. So what I'd like, I'll start with you again, Karen, about the opportunities you see for bringing together these communities that I think have a lot to contribute to the conversation.
Well, I'll just go back to my my earlier comment about where we were then in 2002 versus now, and it is remarkable the different communities that are interested in urban now. I mean, especially funders. That's the thing that I think is really remarkable, right? So whether it's the bank or the Rockefeller or the Ford Foundation, so many different international programs and funders have an urban focus. To me, that's one of the big opportunities, is that it's not only looking, I mean, we as researchers don't have to just look at, let's say, NSF or NASA or EPA, but also looking at other places and potential funders who are interested at the intersection. I mean, I can speak for some of my interactions with Ford and Rockefeller. I mean, they're interested in the intersection of resilience, development, and urbanization, not necessarily about the environment, but environment certainly is a catalyst for a lot of these interactions. So to me, that's one of the big opportunities. The other big opportunity is just changes in the way in which we're doing education now, right? New programs where students can bring together committees of advisors who are geographers, statisticians, ecologists, and ethicists, let's say. And I think that, to me, is one of the biggest exciting advances and opportunities moving forward, is for students to look and study urban systems, not through only one single disciplinary lens, but really taking multiple lenses together. To me, that's a huge opportunity. You didn't ask about challenges, but I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention the challenge. And I think a big challenge is, and I've seen this many, many times, is that people have all the best intentions in coming together, but the interactions or collaborations may be very superficial. And so I think it's going to be a big challenge for us to dig a little bit deeper and say, okay, what do we really mean by sustainability of an urban system, if that's even possible? And what are the frameworks that we're starting with and using, and to lay those out on the table. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that regard.
Okay, thanks. You actually anticipated my two follow-up questions, so this is great. This is marvelous, and this was not scripted. All right, Shuaib, would you like to comment on that, please?
Yeah, I just want to add that in terms of opportunities, cities in Africa and the global south generally are kind of at crossroads in terms of which way to take for transition. So there is lots of opportunities there to explore different pathways to transition to sustainability. On the backdrop of course, asking the question what sustainability is like in a city, in view of the fragmentation of ecology within regions that cities lie or exist, and also the issue of sustainable infrastructure in there. The other element to it is the challenge around human resource. Traditionally in Africa, planners are trained as planner designers. And then the other category that are in charge of cities are managers of cities. We're increasingly starting to see that there might be a need, and possibly, in the context of urban sustainability, for professionals who fall in between the urban designers and the managers, those who understand the critical elements of design, but those understand management, but also, in line with the comment by Karen about interdisciplinarity, that understand issues to do with urban ecology, nature, and the interactions that happen at city, region, or even micro scale. So professionals who would be able to straddle the different scales at which the urban fabric is shaped and created. And that is something that we are trying to work on in Africa, to build that community or human resource base that would be able to respond to the challenges.
Excellent, thank you. And so I'm glad you brought up human resources, because maybe as we move along we can add to the question. So David, in addition to what I asked originally, what kind of students do we need to be training in order to really tackle the kinds of questions that are integrated, that are focusing on urban sustainability, in addition to the original question?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think the two, in a sense, are inseparable. And I've always felt, perhaps because my own training starting in South Africa and continuing in the UK has always been interdisciplinary, that the boundaries between disciplines are one of the great hindrances of the way in which education has been formalized within the Western academy, broadly speaking, and as a result of which kind of interdisciplinary work was either frowned upon, and some places still is frowned upon, or has been regarded as something of Cinderella. So the kinds of processes, the kinds of challenges we're dealing with today, global change in the broadest sense, globalization in all its complexities, environmental change, climate change, whatever we call it, in a sense, bring home the importance of transcending those boundaries. And one of the great things I think about the way ASU has approached this is that GEOS and the other sustainability institutes, in a sense, take that almost as point of departure. But in so many other places, that is still the exception, or it's something that vice chancellors or presidents, you call in this part of the world, talk about. Occasionally they get to actually do something about it, but they're never quite sure how to handle it. And when it comes to programs, and when it comes to how academic faculty like us get our promotions or our work is valorized and validated, people who do spend most of their time and their energy across disciplinary boundaries have a really hard time. Because ultimately, promotion committees, selection committees, external national reviews of the sort that we suffer from in the UK and many other countries nowadays are almost exclusively disciplinary in nature and origin. And the same is true of the curriculum. And in a sense, coming back to your question, one of the real challenges, therefore, is almost to work back from our research to redesign the curricula that we provide to reflect the nature of the research we're doing, because A, that makes it much more interesting for our students, because it's, as it were, directly informed by the work we do, but crucially also that the curriculum starts to reflect the complexities we recognize and work on in the world we all nowadays inhabit, and get away from this kind of 18th, 19th century myth that there is something uniquely called economics and something else uniquely called sociology or geography or law or whatever, and that somehow this is fundamentally different from whatever it is across whichever boundary previously delimited those disciplines. So the university of the future, when we take care of and assimilate all the technological advances which are transforming certain aspects of how we teach, but not necessarily what we teach. And the real challenge, I think, would be the university of the future should actually have much more to do with the kinds of issues and problematics that we confront and how we attempt to make the world a better place, in quote marks, than reflecting the pedagogics of 150 or 200 years ago. And I think, from my experience in different parts of the world, students would respond hugely positively, and actually that probably would contribute as much as anything else to get them engaged and keep them engaged and ensure that dissertation work, whatever, where they try to carry out in practice the conceptual, theoretical, and methodological tools that we give them in class, would sustain that interest, and then in turn translate much better in terms of their employability post-tertiary education.
All right, thank you, David. And we'd like to think that here at ASU, the future is now, that we're doing exactly as you described.
That's a whole different debate.
Yes, it is. All right. And you'd lose. All right, so Patty. So I'd like you to speak, and I'm sure you already have it in your notes, about your particular experience at NCAR, because you are, I think, one of a few or a handful of social scientists working in an atmospheric sciences research institute. So from your perspective, I think it would be interesting to answer those questions that we posed.
Well, yeah. And I want to refer first to the opportunities that I see already happening at NCAR. For once, we receive a lot of calls from national governments and regional entities to address issues of how do we improve our weather services, how do we create or even improve our climate services. And being a social scientist, I keep saying, well, the first thing you don't do is you don't go and tell people what to do and how do they change their behavior, because if you are a parent, you know that does not work. They don't care, so what you need to do is to engage in a mutual learning conversation, which is hard, because what I have learned at NCAR, and it took me like 3 years to understand, is everyone wants to be acknowledged, and my colleagues at NCAR want their models to be used. They always say, how can we apply our models to whatever? So, I mean, if you start from, if you use an understanding approach, right? I understand where you come from, and try to focus on questions that different communities can address and are willing to address, are interesting for their discipline, because I really think that to be in interdisciplinary science, you need to be very good at what you do as sociologists, etc., and willing to go beyond your little box, right? Both, and that's challenging. So that's one thing I think works. We also, I mean, there is just now a lot of conversation on the need to do co-production, etc., and I think that it's easy to say and harder to do. First of all, because we have really different ways of knowing, and not everyone in an interdisciplinary team wants to go beyond their box. There are always some that want to, and others that just say, tell me what you want, I'll do it, etc. But also, the structure of incentives, the carrots and sticks of the institutions also plays a role. I mean, we really need to understand that, first of all, decision makers are dealing with 20 problems at the same time. So you come with climate change or whatever consideration so they have a different structure, and we need to understand those differences and embrace them. And again, that's why but we will come to the solution, the next step. So, but again, I really think that it's easy to say that we need to come together. It's harder because we have different mental models, and we need to embrace that too, and see in which conversation we can engage that really, for which we have a say, a contribution.
Okay, thanks, Patty. I know that in the audience there's a certain future Earth curiosity. This is something that has received a lot of attention and discussion, and there's some misunderstandings about what it is and what it can do. And I think it's safe to say that even as a future Earth project, we're a little confused about what the potential is, and what we can do with it. But if we cast aside the current state of the structure, what I'd like each of the panelists to do is to comment on how can we use the key messages of Future Earth, which I think resonates with this project and with certainly what I know a lot of you in the audience work on. And that's really the notion of how do you bring together the global environmental change community in such a way with stakeholders that we can start to build the future that we want. So I think that's a short form for how do we make the world, an urban world, sustainable. So given that, maybe we'll start with Shuaib. So Shuaib, would you like to lead us off on how can, if we could design and capture the essence of Future Earth, how would we make that happen? What do we need?
Thank you, Chris. I think that through our experience in UGEC and other kind of research work that we've done, it's clear that the targeted category of users of the knowledge is shifting, it's moving. The other thing also is that there is a category of targeted users, and that is public policy actors. I would take it generally, that are either not ready to utilize the knowledge right away, or the time between which the knowledge is utilized and the time that it is possibly applied or uptaken is so long to be realized in our time. So I think that to create this co-production of knowledge, we think that the focus needs to be changed a little bit, and we look at the people who are most likely going to take action with the emerging knowledge, and that is at community level, working with municipalities, working with city councils, and this partnership between academia and municipalities and community level, organization is growing, at least from the region where I come from, and picking up from the earlier comment by Karen about the growing interest by donors to fund that. There's actually increasing funding that goes to interdisciplinary kind of work, which requires that you would have to work with civil society organizations, communities, and you would, and also people who make decisions at the local level. If you're going to move or change the public policy domain, and you start with the top, that is possibly the UN, possibly the governments or regional organizations of the UN, that is a good thing, but it is hard from our experience. So perhaps starting from the other way could be one possible way of building this.
One strategy. Okay, Patty?
I agree with the fact that there are already many donors and organizations that are interested in engaging in co-produce or participatory science. I'm also experiencing firsthand in Boulder, and we have been suggesting within our transition team something that some people call living urban laboratories, or user-inspired interdisciplinary efforts that do not only work on their science per se, but engage in defining the problem together with stakeholders, in identifying the sources of the problem and the way in which different disciplines can contribute to addressing the question that has been defined by scholars, decision makers, communities of practice in regional to local projects. And besides that, engaging in this conversation is very exciting for students because they can really work in efforts that are really, that have a landscape, a place, you know, a contour, a boundary, and they of course can focus on their disciplinary domain, right, contributing to that broader effort. I also think that we require a lot of synthesis and a lot of auto-evaluation of what we are doing, because honestly, we do not always get this right. Mostly we make mistakes in the process, and there needs to be a lot of reflection on what we are doing. In short, both at the national, international, and city to region level, there are already possibilities to get some funding and some money to engage in this different conversation.
David?
Thanks, Chris. Growing up in South Africa when I did, there was no television, and I remember, like probably everybody else on the planet at the time, being completely excited by the Apollo moon missions. But in the absence of television, we had to be glued quite literally with our ears to the radio. And therefore, I remember certain of those kind of classic exchanges more clearly, perhaps, because we didn't have the visual dimension to distract us. And one of the ones that kind of stands out is, Houston, we have a problem. That was a hardware problem. But the crucial point is it was somebody in a spaceship circling the Earth, assessing the fact that the world looked rather different from space, but there was a very specific technological problem that was going to challenge the future of the mission. Fast forward 50-odd years, and I think Houston, we have a problem applies at least as strongly today as it did then, but it's not a hardware problem, it's a planetary problem. It's a planet Earth problem, and it's actually also a future Earth problem, to come back to your point, Chris. But how do we address that in terms of the complexities? And we've been talking about the curriculum, getting away from constraints of disciplinary boundaries, but the co-production methodologies that Patty raised and increasing interest is indeed one of the reasons why I took this very challenging job to lead Mistra Urban Futures about 18 months ago. And this is an international research center on urban sustainability, headquartered in Gothenburg in Sweden, but working in Sweden, the UK, South Africa, Kenya, and we're about to set up a couple more platforms in other parts of the world to ensure that we have a greater, as it were, global footprint for the kind of work we do. But the point is that it operates through a distinctive approach to co-production, which is transdisciplinary, by which we mean engaging between academic and non-academic researchers. And note, I did not say between academics and practitioners. That's another one of those kind of false dichotomies, because all the people who work in our projects, regardless of what their institutional home is, are researchers. So it's academic and non-academic researchers of different sorts. Local, regional authorities, national research agencies, one or two private sector, environmental, architectural and other practices that share the values. And the point is that they come together to define jointly a problem of mutual interest and importance, then to design the methodology by means of which to address that problem, and ultimately through the research process to come up with one or more potentially appropriate solutions, which then get iterated, and ultimately the institution within the partnership that has the legal responsibility to do the implementation is then much more likely to be able to do so and do so successfully, because by virtue of having been one of the partners in this very complex research team all the way through, it has been designed, it has been made appropriate to the institutional politics, to the budgetary cycles, to the implementational landscape, if you like, to put it in broadest terms. And that really also provides the backing of all the institutions represented in the team, and makes it much more likely that implementation will take place and take place successfully with appropriate practical application than the conventional kind of expert-led knowledge that we often do in academic projects where, the donors or the funders are always say, well, we must have policy recommendations and we want to be able to measure impact. down the line. So, whether it's that or a commercial consultancy, you hand over a report, it's got something called findings and recommendations at the end. You say, here you are, go away and do. And the only doing they do is putting it on the shelf to collect dust, or maybe in the filing cabinet to avoid the dust, but with the same practical lack of application, precisely because it isn't, as it were, fitted, it isn't easily assimilated in the implementational environment. And that kind of approach, and by the way, it's not just individual researchers coming together to do their thing in that way. The basis on which we work is through institutional partnerships. So when I mentioned the universities, local authorities, regional authorities, research institutes on transportation or water or environmental research or whatever it is, the hard work is at the beginning to forge and to maintain those institutional relationships. But they are really important because it means that the researchers in the projects, and each project has a different team, have, as it were, the political blessing and the financial support from the mayor or the governor or the chief exec or whoever it is of those institutions, and there is funding put in. So there is genuine co-ownership of the whole process. It's not without problems, it's not without challenges and limitations, but it is a fundamentally different approach. And I think from my perspective, having, as it were, been involved in this and for decades before, having done variations of participatory and participatory action research in Africa and Asia and so on, and in a sense co-production is a more enhanced form of that, one of the crucial things it does is it forces us, where we are academics in this case, to get away from our traditional academic arrogance that we are the experts, we're the specialists, we have the tools, and we know what's best for you. Because the you don't exist, we're all in it together. It's the we in the research process and the application of the results of a particular research project.
Okay, thank you, David. I want to modify the question slightly for Karen to not just think about Future Earth or a framework that might be similar in spirit, but also to comment on something that you brought up earlier, and that is the fact that the urban has now become a prominent subject in IPCC. It's also become a prominent subject in the Sustainable Development Goals, which actually has an explicit of the 17 goals. One of them is to focus on building healthy and resilient cities. So in addition to a Future Earth-like thing, what can we use the SDGs or IPCC also to forward some really important research?
Before I answer that question, I want to do a quick survey because you've all been a little too quiet.
We will get to them, I promise.
I'm curious to know, just by show of hands, how many people here know what WCRP stands for? I'm not going to ask you what it stands for, but how many people know what WCRP stands for? Of course, I'm not surprised you do. So what about Diversitas? A few more people. IGBP? A few more. An IHDP? All right, so we've been knocking around all these acronyms, and I'm just going to break it down to very simple English terms, right? So before Future Earth, there were these 4 global change programs that focused on climate, biodiversity, the geosphere, biosphere, and humans. And those 4 global change programs, each of these programs having many projects like Eugec, these 4 global change programs have been merged into one big program called Future Earth. So we've got people who are interested in biodiversity, the geosphere, humans, and climate, now all holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Clearly, these 4 different communities are interested in urban from many different perspectives, whether it's urban heat island and urban canopy or urban impacts on biodiversity or whatever it may be. And I think a key issue moving forward for urban and Future Earth is how do we bring these 4 very distinct yet somewhat overlapping communities together to define what a new program or project will look like. Because UGEC started from the human program, and we reached out to these other programs. But these other programs had an urban programs. Diversitas had an urban program. IGBP had an urban program. And so I think that's one of the big questions is how do we bring these different groups together? I do want to comment very briefly on co-production because I think many people immediately assume that co-production means that we are doing fundamental science that has an immediate policy relevance. And I think from my perspective, there's a real danger in that. Because as a scholar, as a scientist, I don't know what local practitioners or policymakers should do. And one of the things that we were constantly reminded of during the IPCC assessment process was we need to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And I think that there's a way in which we assume that if we're doing urban work, it should be locally policy relevant. And I would argue, and this is based on the work of the IPCC chapter, that so much of the impacts of urbanization on the environment, even though it happens perhaps at local scales, is really mediated and framed by what national and regional frameworks, laws, governance, and institutions. And so I would argue that the audience should not necessarily be local policymakers, but actually in many cases it should be regional policymakers or national policymakers. And I would also argue that in the near future, we might need to have some international governance structure around cities, not just around nation states, which is what the UN is based on. And so anyhow, I would just caution that I think co-production doesn't necessarily need to be around co-producing with local policymakers. It could be co-producing with national policymakers or others. In terms of your question around urban having such a larger focus with these different communities. I mean, I think this is the big opportunity moving forward. We have the climate community, which is very well financed in terms of research. The development community, both of these communities really interested in urban, and I think the question is how do we harness this interest? I think there's a huge let's say, challenge. I'll focus on this challenge, which is this window of opportunity for shaping cities of the future is going to close. Many of the cities in Asia and East Asia and Africa and South Asia, cities that haven't been developed are going to be developed really over the next 30 to 40 years. And they're cities that are being redeveloped now and new cities that are being constructed. And so there's an urgency for the kind of science that can help shape these trajectories. And I've been saying for a long time that we don't need and this is maybe dangerous to say as a researcher, we don't need the optimal science and we don't need the best science. Actually, we need the science that helps us avoid catastrophic outcomes. And so many cities are being developed right now in Africa, in South Asia, in Asia, that we don't have the luxury of time to wait for another 10 years or 2 more rounds of a funding cycle from whatever agency to come up with the optimal solution, because we actually need to think about a very different type of science for the cities that are being developed. And I think that science absolutely needs to feed into what's happening in the development arena and also with funding towards climate science.
Thanks, Karen. It's actually, all of you have done a great job of anticipating my questions, because my next one was going to be, how do we start to scale solutions or outcomes or interventions? Because that seems to be one of the great tasks of sustainability and something that we deal with on a daily basis here in the Institute. We recognize, given the urgency of the issues that face us, that we can't be focusing just on communities of 1,000 or 10,000. We need to be making impacts that affect hundreds of millions of people if we're going to avoid the kind of catastrophic changes that occur. And there's a couple ways that we think about scaling. You can scale through the introduction of a great idea and hope that it diffuses, or you can start with a system that already is scaled and then try to change the direction, nudge it in the right direction of a system that's already scaled. And when you look at urbanization and the scale of urbanization that's occurring right now, there's an opportunity to actually make a difference to how that very powerful machine goes forward. What I'd like to do now is I've been monopolizing the questions up here, so I'd like to open it up to the audience, and it looks like Mark is on the ready. Does that mean you're going to hand around a microphone to somebody? It looks like it is. All right, so questions from the audience for any of the panelists, please. Libby.
thank you all for your comments. It was a really, as one of the speakers said, really inspirational to hear what was going on.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh,
Libby?
sure.
Yeah.
My name is Libby Wentz, and I'm a professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning and the Dean of Social Sciences here at Arizona State University. And so mostly with my hat as Dean of Social Sciences, I've been thinking a lot about the curriculum issue. And of course, being here at ASU, I've thought a lot about the access to education through online platforms. And I think that those issues drive a lot of the questions that you're answering. And I think you mentioned something about curriculum reform, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and how that plays into us thinking about urbanization and global climate change, and if any of the Eugec projects think about the educational part of it.
Okay, thanks. I think the answer will have to be different according to different national, statewide, perhaps local campus constraints and procedures. But in my experience, these sorts of issues of urbanization and environmental change, which I do teach at undergrad and master's level, as well as supervising PhDs, are precisely the sort of things that do engage students with great enthusiasm. And indeed, we've noticed that in some of our courses that don't have that kind of content, of course there are other contemporary challenges, globalization, which I mentioned earlier, there's actually pressure through the student participation channels requesting that coverage of that be included, or if there's only a little bit, that it be enhanced. And I think that the way to do it is partly that we generally teach best that which we know best, and that is generally what we're researching, which of course presupposes that we're research active, and that's another issue. But crucially also that it provides the sort of thing of which students have experience in terms of their daily lives. When we started out in the early 2000s, it was still quite accepted for people to say and to believe that climate change really wasn't a problem today. It was our children or our grandchildren's problems, and that provided politicians with the easy get-out clause that, well, that was well past the next election, or if I'm standing for re-election, the election after that, and therefore it was part of my legacy to my political successors. That luxury no longer exists. And, yesterday was supposed to be the first time that 90 degrees Fahrenheit had been reached in Phoenix in February, previously back end of March. And equivalent extremes are emerging, hot, cold fluctuations, so on, globally, day in, day out, year in, year out. And yes, this could be short-term perturbation, it could be all sorts of things, but nevertheless, it's the kind of variability and the kind of exposure to extreme events that, 20 years ago, or our parents simply didn't know with that frequency and that level of awareness that it was something that is changing, something that is troubling. And that now provides the opportunity in terms of curriculum, it provides the anchor in terms of the kind of research we do and we need to do more of, but it also makes it impossible for politicians to hide. And the US has a particular problem in this regard, I understand and know well, but even in other countries, many African countries, the kinds of places and the kinds of debates that Shuaib and I have with municipal and regional, provincial, whatever, national leaders and people in the international agencies, the landscape has changed over the time that we've been working in Eugec, from the sort of where you couldn't even engage in that kind of debate with politicians because they were concerned with basic needs and immediate short-term pressures from their constituents, and climate change was kind of, as I say, 20, 30 years down the track. But nowadays, you go to Dakar in Senegal, and the mayors of some of the 63 municipalities, Metro Dakar, are dealing with the consequences now, where houses are being destroyed by saltwater and sea encroachment, whereas 10, 15 years ago, there was a 20-meter gap between the high water mark and the nearest built structure. Now the structures are being damaged and destroyed. You go to places on the desert or the semi-desert margins, and the challenges are there in terms of access to water, reliability of supply, salinization of groundwater, other things that, again, are familiar in this part of the world. And the examples are as frequent and as important in Europe, in Central Asia, in East Asia, in Australasia. And that provides the kinds of anchors and the stimuli that really do engage students wherever we might be teaching or researching. And that's the kind of thing that makes it so much more real. And you can then teach some of the fundamentals through the principles of engaging with real-world issues rather than just some sort of esoteric ideas in a classroom.
All right, thank you. David Karen would like to respond to that as well.
I should take one thing.
Well, Libby, I'm really glad you asked the question about curriculum reform, because I think this is where we have huge gaps. Over the last year or so, I've been doing a review of urban-related programs in the United States, just to get a sense of what we're teaching our students. Are we really preparing our students for the urban challenges? And one of the things that I found, which was not surprising, but I think is a big gap, is that we are not preparing our students for understanding, much less really studying, the urban dynamics in the places where they're the greatest, and that is in Africa and Asia. So if you look at most urban curriculum, the classics that we teach, and I don't even have to mention the names because you know who I'm talking about, all of you, those are based on a urban transition or urban transitions that occurred in North America and in Europe during a very different time in history. And I was just in Singapore 2 weeks ago visiting Yale, NUS, a new college in Singapore, and looking at their urban studies curriculum. And we had a long conversation about how they are really trying to draw on literature that's based in the region. And not only based in the region, scholars that are based in the region, but very much theories and frameworks that are based on local circumstances. And I think we here in North America absolutely need to do that very quickly, is transform our curriculum so that if we're training students to work in Africa, to work in Asia, they absolutely cannot take Jane Jacobs and think that they're going to see Soho or Greenwich or whatever it is when they go to Dakar, right? And so we aren't teaching our students in those kinds of frameworks and those kinds of theories. They exist, but it takes a lot more work than just going to the mainstream literature. So I think that we have a lot more work to do as educators in thinking about what are the readings and what are the theories and frameworks to introduce students to.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? There's Matt over there.
Matt Georgescu, School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning. Thank you to the event organizers, and thank you to the panelists for providing excellent commentary. Intriguing at times. I was really struck by Karen's last statement about where the science needs to be in terms of optimizing, and perhaps that not being the path that we need to reach for. So I think our society is based upon optimizing. And so at what point do we, I don't want to say instill new culture, but perhaps rethink, if this is what you think is a optimal pathway forward, at what point do we need to rethink the way we think in order to take science that's good enough for policy to meet these time criteria, right? Essentially, that's what's I imagine driving this idea. Although I'd like to hear more about what is the driving impetus for science, because it could be misinterpreted by some as saying, "Look, we're giving you our tax dollars, and you're not reaching for the stars. Maybe we shouldn't be giving you our tax dollars anymore." So I found that really intriguing, and I very much appreciate and respect that. Sure, a new paper comes out and says we should do this. A new paper comes out and adds another decimal point, and perhaps, well, now we need to rethink everything. At what point do we stop? So that's certainly part of the game, but I'd just like to hear more clarification on that.
So we are used to thinking about generating science where we find the best solution, let's say, or the optimal solution, or optimal solutions. But there is a big vacuum gap between the solutions or the outcomes from science versus practice. And practitioners and cities aren't, it's not like as though cities around the world are waiting for the right solutions, right? Cities are continually being developed right now as we speak during this symposium. And so the analogy that I've been giving is, it's like designing an airplane while it's already taken off. We can continue to talk about and do research that says this is the optimal design for the airplane, but the airplane's already taken off. So we need to rethink, I think, the types of questions that we would ask given that the plane has already taken off. Does that make sense?
Sure, and then we'll go to you, Pat.
It strikes me I also think that we need to rethink science, and I think that in the social sciences domain, many scientists have already shown that this idea that humans are rational beings and that they made they optimize and that they made the best choice based on even limited information has been proved wrong. And what other social scientists have shown is that usually people get involved in what we call social practices, such as taking showers, such as suddenly using softeners in our to make our clothes nicer, etc., not based on rational decision making. And why is it that I'm saying this? Because many scientists try to or think still that that's the way people operate. People filter things and decisions and actions through values, culture, commercials, many other things that are the most irrational. I mean, people are fearful, etc., etc. So I really want to point to that because this also is a call of attention to the fact that we cannot think that, well, the world is already almost breaking into little pieces, and if we don't act today, something will happen. Because guess what? People do not react to that. They just say, I don't want to know about that, I just want to forget about that, etc., etc. So, another problem I have with this kind of approach, how do we engage science with policy and society? Through a social engineering approach, or through an approach that understands and try to really get at how is it that people make decisions and engage in actions. So I really want that we are careful with that. Another important thing, I know that there is a lot of focus on Asia because it's growing on steroids, right? In Africa because it's growing on steroids too, in different ways, right, for different reasons. It is equally important to understand what's happening with regions such as Latin America that are already urbanized and are still faced with many challenges and are still showing many innovations, many experiments that we need to learn from and capture and understand. So really, let's be careful. Different regions are urbanizing, growing in different ways, some with infrastructures provided or others not, some with governance systems which are multi-level, by the way, in every country, right, are affected by international, national, regional, local actors. And we need to understand how they develop and how is it that people act and engage in responses to our environmental challenges.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from the dynamic duo, it turns out, Chuck and Nancy. So I'm going to take both of your questions at the same time and then let the panelists respond, okay? You are a microphone.
I am. I'm Chuck Redmond from School of Sustainability, and I'm in a twirl from all these interesting things that have just gone around between Patty and Karen and Matt and Libby. I agree that education and how we think about things both in research and in education, is probably central to what we want to do. And I want to take that overused word of the last 15 minutes, optimal, and think of it in a slightly different way. And I want to challenge us to say in our teaching and research, are there such things as optimal solutions? And I think disciplinarily, there's lots of disciplines that strive for optimal solutions. And I think that's a question, and then that challenges us, what's the alternative? And I prefer words like resilience and capacity building to try to find an actual outcome that I'm going to lock into. And so I think that requires both in research and in teaching a rethinking of how we're doing all this. And I'm glad Patty brought up Latin America, because Nancy and my project focuses on exactly that concept, that there may be insights from there that we need to be learning. But I'm lost on whether we need to work at both contextual down to the actual versus regional versus state versus international. And I think the answer is yes, whatever the question was. And I'm anxious to see all of this happen. I'm going to raise one other thing, and then I'll give it over to my partner. Your history with social science makes this harder, and Libby probably can speak to that in detail, but we agree less. My experience with multi-sectoral administrations is it's a lot easier to agree in chemistry than it is in sociology or geography or anthropology. And we have an uphill battle with that, because we have more ways to see the world at the same time. And it isn't just that our subject matters are different in different disciplines, because they aren't. They usually overlap. But our ways of knowing are different even within our sector. And I think UGEC takes that on, straight on, and puts it in the worst place, urbanism, where it's most complicated. Enough said.
That's exactly what Shuaib told me yesterday in our conversation, is that in his experience as a planner, when engineers come together, it doesn't matter where they're from, the hydrological models, they can figure it out if they have the right parameters. But bringing together social scientists that work in different contexts, it's a challenge. Nancy?
Yeah, so they can figure it out, but did they get the right answer?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Right.
And so I mean that's a big challenge. I also just love hearing this discourse, and I think there's some great points about process, how we should be doing science, that all of us should take to heart. And coming speaking as an ecologist, I'm Nancy Grimm, from the School of Life Sciences. I'm an ecologist, and speaking as an ecologist, I think we've seen real changes in my field in the extent to which ecologists are actually willing to engage in anything that has to do with people. And a lot of that has been brought about by the beginnings of our study of cities. Because the traditional ecologist likes to go out into nature and study stuff that is not affected by people, or so they think. So I think there's a lot that I'm really starting to learn, and very, very novice in this, about how to actually engage with the users of information that we're generating, so that we can really co-produce. And I appreciated all the comments about co-production. I think there's also great points that have been made about the problem. And as Karen pointed out, Future Earth exists because it was like these global programs were being like universities with siloed disciplines, and sort of attacking things from, here's the social scientist doing this in the IHDP, and here's the physical scientist doing this in IGBP, and so forth, and biological sciences. The problem is as David pointed out, is a planetary problem. Urbanization is one of the big changes that's happening in the world. So great, we need work on understanding urbanization and how it's happening today. But another one of the big environmental changes is climate change. Another one of the big environmental changes is land transformation. And all of these things have been approached by various programs that are now encapsulated by Future Earth. But I think that the thing that's really, really, really important is that we really resist this tendency to get into our own disciplines and our own comfort zones, because the problems we're talking about are way, way, way bigger than any one discipline can actually get at. And so
It just seems like if the question is how do we as a species whose home is increasingly cities survive in this changing environment. I appreciate the comments about extreme events, because even though you're right, Patty, people will do what they do because of their social group that they're involved with. A lot of climate change education research has shown that. What's really interesting about it is that when there are crises, people sit up and take notice. So when Sandy happened in New York, people sort of went, whoa, climate change, we need to do something. And so another aspect of process is take advantage of opportunities, even if they're sort of scary ones like that. So the global environment is changing a lot, and the problem is really where we live as cities, so we need to approach that, the problem and all of the facets of it, I think, in an interdisciplinary way. And I'm not saying anything you guys haven't already said, but I'm just sort of putting maybe the exclamation point on the end of it from an ecological perspective, that I think that we're willing to now sort of get engaged in this stuff, that ecologists are. So we want to work together on these kinds of problems and figure out, what the solutions are.
So would any of the panelists like to respond to either one of the comments? Yeah. Okay. We need a mic. We're micless.
No, we're not.
Oh, okay.
There we are.
Nancy, I mean, I agree with what you and Chuck, the duo, said. I just want to also learn from history and from what other scholars have found, namely that it is true that disasters or extremes are triggers, right? But there is more to it, right? Why is it that some triggers result in changes that increase capacities? Because as you, Chuck, I'm always like, how do we create, enhance, foster, engage with capacities, right? So again, in some cases, in some cities, the trigger has resulted in changes that seem to be positive, but in others not. And that is mediated by governance, by how we go about listening and engaging with the non-resilient, the people that really need it the most, and whether we have the solution in place. So there is, in short, an interaction between human, right, and governance, and also biophysical factors that come together to explain why in some cases these disasters trigger the changes we want to see, because that's why we are in this conversation, and not that's not the case in others. So we need to also be careful with that, because that will help us engage in catalyzing those drivers of change.
Yeah, I think what you said, Nancy, is absolutely right. And the mere fact that a landmark volume to which several people in this room contributed could be published 2 or 3 years ago, called The Cities and Biodiversity Outlook, attests to the importance of bringing together disciplines and crossing those boundaries in a way that really would have been almost unthinkable a decade or so ago when we started out on the Eugec road, so to speak. But, and Karen is also right that co-production can occur at different scales, not just at the local, and it's crucially important that is the case. But in a kind of existential sense, thinking of the planetary boundaries, as some people like to call them, the interlinkages between urbanization, climate change, and various other challenges, why are we actually sitting here in an auditorium on one of the largest campuses in the country, in one of the largest and fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country, in an area that many people would have argued was unsustainable in relation to the rate and the scale of this kind of urbanization? Why are cities being built and growing, as Karen rightly said, in China, India, many other parts of Asia, Africa, at an unprecedented rate? In places very often, and through processes and according to designs that are known to be unsustainable and are taking little, if any, account of the research evidence that has been built up over several decades in those countries and regions, as well as comparatively elsewhere. And that, I think, drives us to think carefully that it isn't just more academic research, more science that is required that then can be ignored. It's the question of partly it's behavioral, partly it's the political. How do we transcend those divisions? How do we address the economic and the political interests which determine what is happening where and why, despite the research evidence and the knowledge of alternative urban designs, alternative systems, alternative energy supplies, low carbon transitions, all these things that we're concerned with, and rightly so. And that almost is the priority. And that's where, in one sense, the kinds of co-production I was talking about earlier, the kinds of curriculum redesign to make sure that we're training students for the work that needs to be done, but we're addressing that kind of disconnect between the research knowledge and the processes that are led by the captains of industry, the political elites and so on, which are really what is driving the unsustainable urbanization and the other practices that we need to devote much more attention to. And working with them, and it's not everybody's cup of tea, not everybody can do it. It's very difficult. It has even more challenges than working with academics from different disciplinary backgrounds. But I would like to think that if we don't do that, we're never really going to get to the heart of the problem, because only by having the trust, building those relationships with the political elites, regardless of whether it's an autocratic or a supposedly democratic and participatory system, that one can try and do that. And the fact that, taking a very local example, I can call up the mayor of Gothenburg, who comes to our offices, has a personal interest, drives the council to work in this way with the researchers and with people from other authorities and neighboring municipalities. That's much more likely to get us towards more sustainable urbanism in that context than the traditional model where nobody actually is able to challenge the business as usual practices that are driving the unsustainable processes.
Okay, thank you. Shuaib, would you like to say something to that?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Let me make some remarks in regard to the discussion about the optimal solutions, and perhaps even think of it more in a complex way, that by posing more questions, in addition to what Chuck posed, the question that you posed about that. Looking at Africa, and if we can pick maybe two aspects around which science would generate the knowledge and the solutions, and that is space and order. One would ask, what is the definition of that space? What is order, and order for whom? So we're talking about standards that have been developed and embedded in the curriculum that is global north oriented, and then students are trained, they come down to Africa, and then they continue to pursue and develop the city that is actually off the ground in Africa, in many cases. Because when it comes to order, that order as a plane that has already taken off is already defined by some other actors in a different way. That space is defined in so many ways by those actors in urban Africa, and I imagine Latin America and even Asia. So we're talking about here curriculum that needs to take into consideration the contextual, local, specific issues around order and space. And that's when science would become relevant to the different multiple experiences around the world. There was a lot of talk in Africa and even in the papers about planners being trained in the global north, and then they developed cities for the global north and not cities for Africa. And then we developed curriculum, which again was copied from the global north. And then we realized, okay, this is a mistake. We now need to rethink and look at the existential and the experiential way of doing things. So new innovative ways of teaching, like reality studio, urban ecological planning approaches have emerged to take into consideration the diversity in terms of experiences, the different ways that different systems in different locales define space and order. So we're actually, I just want to end by saying we're in a laboratory and the undertaking is huge. It is huge. We're in a laboratory. In that laboratory will continue bouncing on and off micro to macro level issues, whether it is co-production at whatever scale. I think we are experimenting different things.
Excellent. So as the co-chair, I'm going to give Karen Seto the prerogative of the last words and closing remarks. Karen?
Well, I do want to say on behalf of the UGEC project and certainly the SSC, I want to actually thank ASU for hosting the IPO over the last decade. Another trip down memory lane. So right after the science plan was written and approved by IHDP, we did a global search for where the IPO would be housed. And it was very clear back in 2004 that ASU was the place in North America to study cities. And there were other places globally in Europe and Asia that offered and submitted bids to house the IPO. And I think that we made a very strategic and a very good decision to house the IPO here. I think the project has really benefited certainly from the strengths here in urban ecology, the urban LTER. There's been, I think, it's been a very big advantage for the project. And so I want to thank all the administrators and the PIs and the students, postdocs, everyone who have really helped UGEC in that regard. I do want to say, moving forward in terms of Future Earth, I think given Nancy's comments, and I think many of the comments over the last hour and a half, I think there is a big opportunity for UGEC and ASU and the urban work that's being done here to advance urban in Future Earth very loudly. I mean, because as I said earlier, the 4 global change programs, one of them is primarily ecologists, and I cannot think of another place that has a bigger megaphone than this institution in terms of rallying the urban ecology, and not just urban ecology, but the ecology communities. And certainly there's a very large community here working on climate as it interfaces with urban. So, 3 of the 4 global change programs are very well represented by the work that's being done here at ASU. And I think that it is incumbent on all of us as a community to really try to broaden the urban platform in Future Earth moving forward. I will be very excited to step down and let UGEC close, and I'm excited to see what's going to happen in the urban and Future Earth, what that's going to look like, the new scholars who are trained here and elsewhere, and how they're going to imagine and reframe the problems and the new opportunities. So anyway, thank you all for helping us move the project forward over the last 10 years.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. So let me take a moment to again thank the Walton Sustainability Solutions Initiative for co-sponsoring this event. Obviously to the Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability, which provides, in addition to these kinds of venues, the decade of support that you've spoken about, and of course all the faculty, staff, and students who've been engaged in these and other projects. So please join me in thanking our panelists for this excellent session.